On the morning of August 9th, 1974, a woman stood in the East Room of the White House and tried not to cry. She had lived there for 5 years. She had restored its rooms, traveled to war zones on its behalf, and opened its doors to more visitors than any First Lady before her. And now it was ending in front of the entire world. Pat Nixon survived poverty, loss, and 3 decades of political life, and ended up defined almost entirely by something she had no part in. That's the story worth telling, and it starts a long way from Washington, where she came from. Her name at birth was Thelma Catherine Ryan, and she was born on March 16, 1912, in a miner's shack in Ely, Nevada, a copper mining town in the eastern mountains of the state, the kind of place that existed to extract something from the earth and asked nothing comfortable of the people who lived there. Her father, William Ryan, came home from the copper mines in the early hours of the morning before St. Patrick's Day and called her his St. Patrick's babe in the morn. The nickname Pat stuck immediately and never left. She would later go by Patricia in adulthood, a quiet nod to the father she had lost. When she was about a year old, the family packed up and moved to Artesia, California, a small farming community southeast of Los Angeles, where her father had bought a 10-acre truck farm. It was not a comfortable life. The house had no electricity and no indoor plumbing. The children worked the land alongside their father from the time they were old enough to be useful. They grew vegetables. They did what needed doing before and after school. Pat would later say that she never knew what it meant not to work hard, and she said it without self-pity, which is more telling than the words themselves. Her mother, Kate, died of cancer in 1924, when Pat was 12 years old. From that morning forward, Pat took over the running of the household, the cooking, the cleaning, the care of her father and her 2 older brothers, Tom and Bill. She did it without being asked and without complaint. She kept her grades up through all of it. She performed in the junior and senior class plays. She was, by the recollections of people who knew her then, someone who moved through hard circumstances without making a production of them. She graduated from Excelsior Union High School in 1929 and started saving money for college. Then, in May 1930, her father died too. He had been sick with a lung disease called silicosis, an occupational illness from the years he had spent in the mines, and Pat had nursed him through it with the same quiet steadiness she had applied to everything else. She was 18 years old, and both of her parents were gone. There were no other adults. There was no inheritance to speak of. She was, in the most literal sense, on her own. What she did next tells you something essential about who she was. She didn't stop. She enrolled at Fullerton Junior College and held down a job at a local bank while she attended classes. Then an elderly couple asked if she'd drive them across the country to New York City, and she took the opportunity to spend time there, working as a secretary, as an X-ray technician at a hospital, and as a retail clerk, saving everything she could and spending as little as possible. The city didn't intimidate her. She observed it, worked in it, and left when she had saved enough to go back to school. She returned west and enrolled at the University of Southern California in 1931 on a scholarship. She took whatever work the campus offered, office jobs, retail shifts, and occasional appearances as an extra in films, a gig that paid decently for an afternoon's work and asked nothing of her that she minded giving. She graduated cum laude in 1937 with a degree in merchandising and a teaching certificate that USC considered equivalent to a graduate degree. She had paid for most of her education herself, across 5 years and 2 cities, without anyone holding a door open for her. She accepted a position as a high school teacher in Whittier, California. She was 25 years old. She had buried both her parents, put herself through college on wages from jobs most people wouldn't have lasted a week at, and arrived in Whittier with a plan that had nothing to do with politics and nothing to do with anyone named Nixon. But before we get to Richard, it's worth sitting with that part of her story for a moment, because the rest of her life would be lived largely in service of someone else's ambitions, and the life she had built before she met him is the only version of Pat Ryan that was entirely her own. Richard, and the life she chose. In February 1938, Pat auditioned for a role in a production at the Whittier Community Players. A young lawyer named Richard Milhouse Nixon was also there, trying out for a part. He saw her across the room and, by most accounts, was immediately captivated. He told her that evening, they had barely spoken, that he was going to marry her. She went home and told her roommates she had met someone who was, in her words, out of his mind. Richard was persistent in a way that bordered on relentless. He learned to ice skate because she liked it. He drove her to Los Angeles for dates with other men and waited in the car. He wrote her letters in the language of someone who had no idea how to conceal what he felt. Gradually, she came around. They had more in common than she had initially given him credit for. Both had grown up poor. Both had put themselves through school by working. Both were shy in groups and more comfortable in motion than in stillness. She told people later that he had a kind of drive she recognized. They married on June 21st, 1940, in a small ceremony at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California, and honeymooned in Mexico. The plan, as they discussed it, was to save money and travel the world. Then the war came. Richard volunteered for the Navy in 1942 and was commissioned as a lieutenant. He was sent to the South Pacific, where he served in the Naval Air Transport Command. Pat moved first to Washington and then to San Francisco, working as a price analyst for the Office of Price Administration, a wartime government agency that set price controls on consumer goods. It was exacting, detail-heavy work, and she was good at it. She was always good at exacting, detail-heavy work. They wrote letters back and forth across the Pacific throughout the war years. The letters Richard sent her were full of feeling in a way his public presence never quite managed to be. When he came home in 1946, he had a plan. In 1946, Richard Nixon ran for a seat in California's 12th Congressional District. Pat worked on the campaign, doing research, drafting literature, staffing the office. She was, effectively, his first campaign manager. He won. They packed up and moved to Washington with their daughter Tricia, who had been born that same year. Their second daughter Julie was born in 1948. For the next 6 years, Pat watched her husband move from the House to the Senate, and then, in 1952, onto the national stage in a way that neither of them could fully have anticipated, and in a way that put Pat in front of 50 million people for the first time in circumstances that were anything but comfortable. The cloth coat. In September 1952, Richard Nixon was the Republican nominee for vice president alongside Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his political career nearly ended before it properly began. A New York newspaper broke a story claiming that Nixon had been using an $18,000 private fund set up by wealthy California supporters to cover personal expenses. The implication was that he could be bought. The pressure on Eisenhower to drop him from the ticket was immediate and serious. Several major newspapers called for Nixon to withdraw. His own advisors weren't sure he could survive it. Nixon's response was to go directly to the American public on television, a medium that was still new enough that no one fully understood its power. He sat in a television studio in Hollywood on September 23, 1952, at a desk, with Pat sitting to his side and slightly behind him, and delivered a 30-minute address to an audience of roughly 60 million people. It was the largest television audience in history up to that point. He laid out his finances in exhaustive detail, every mortgage, every loan, every asset. He described their modest life in a way that ordinary Americans recognized. He noted that Pat didn't own a mink coat. She had, he said, a respectable Republican cloth coat. And then he told the story of Checkers, a black and white cocker spaniel that had been sent to the family as a gift, and which his daughter Tricia had named. He said, regardless of what anyone said about it, they were keeping the dog. The response was overwhelming. Telegrams and letters poured into Republican headquarters in volumes that broke records. Nixon stayed on the ticket. Eisenhower and Nixon won the election that November, and Pat Nixon became Second Lady of the United States. She had sat very still during the broadcast. The camera had found her face a few times, and what people saw was a woman holding herself together with absolute precision, not performing composure, but genuinely composed, even as her husband aired their finances on national television and used her coat as a prop in his defense. She had not been entirely comfortable with it. She had asked, when he was making his notes on the plane to Los Angeles, why people needed to know the details of their private finances. He told her that people in politics live in a fishbowl. She already knew that. She had been the one living in it beside him. What the Checkers speech did, beyond saving Richard's political career, was establish a template that would follow Pat for the rest of her life. She was background. She was support. She was evidence of his character. The camera found her face to confirm what he was saying about himself. That is a particular kind of invisibility, being seen only as a reflection of someone else, and it was something she would have to navigate for more than 2 decades, the long campaign. The 8 years of the Eisenhower administration, from 1953 to 1961, were years of near-constant travel and near-constant performance. As Second Lady, Pat accompanied Richard on diplomatic trips to 53 countries across Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. She was warm with people in a way he wasn't naturally. She remembered names, greeted strangers without the slight stiffness that followed her husband everywhere, moved through crowds with an ease that press photographers noticed and that ordinary people responded to immediately. She became, in her own right, a figure that foreign governments were glad to receive. The role of Second Lady had no official duties, no staff, and no portfolio. What it had was expectation, to appear, to represent, to reflect well on the administration, and to do it all without either disappearing into the background or drawing too much attention. Pat navigated that with the same efficiency she had brought to every other task in her life. She was not performing warmth. She was not performing composure. Those were simply what she had. In 1958, the Nixons traveled to South America on a goodwill tour that became something considerably more dangerous than goodwill. In Lima, Peru, they encountered student protesters who threw rocks and spat at them. Nixon stepped forward into the confrontation in ways that some aides thought were reckless. Pat held her ground without retreat and without visible alarm. The worst came in Caracas, Venezuela. Their motorcade was stopped in the street by a mob. The car windows were smashed. Demonstrators rocked the vehicle, and for a period that lasted long enough to be genuinely frightening, the outcome was uncertain. Secret Service agents later said that Pat remained the calmest person in the car throughout. She did not escalate, did not give the crowd anything to work with, did not make it about herself. When it was over and they were safe, she gave the press exactly as much of the story as was needed and no more. In 1960, Nixon ran for president against John F. Kennedy. Pat was with him across the country from the start to the finish of the longest campaign she had yet endured. She was effective at it. Genuinely, measurably effective. in the way that campaign managers noticed and tried to deploy as often as possible. She was better at the individual encounter, the rope line, the conversation with a voter at a diner, than almost anyone else on the campaign. She also hated the process of it, the management of her image, the feeling of being deployed rather than present. She had once told the writer Gloria Steinem, in a conversation during the 1968 campaign, that she had never had time to think about who she wanted to be or what she wanted. She had only ever worked. There had been no dreaming. Politics extended that condition rather than changing it. It was more work, longer hours, in public, with the added weight of other people's projections about who she was supposed to be. Nixon lost narrowly to Kennedy in November 1960 in one of the closest elections in American history. Pat reportedly wept on election night, not from grief about the result, according to some who were there, but from something closer to relief that the machinery had stopped. She had genuinely wanted to go home to California and have a life that belonged to them. She got less than 2 years of it. In 1962, Nixon ran for governor of California, a race Pat had argued against from the start. She thought he had pushed his luck enough, that private life was both earned and available, and that the people of California had not asked for him the way Washington had. He ran anyway. He lost by a larger margin than anyone had anticipated, and in the immediate aftermath gave a famous press conference in which he told reporters they wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Pat watched it. Then the family moved to New York, where Richard joined a Wall Street law firm. These were, in the recollections of people close to them, the years that came closest to what ordinary life might have looked like for them. There was money. There was privacy. The girls were teenagers, then young adults. Tricia and Julie grew up in a household that was not being watched. Pat had time that was not scheduled by other people. Then Richard started making moves toward 1968, and the quiet ended. Pat did not try to stop him this time. She had learned something across the years of runs and losses and campaigns and recoveries about the particular shape of her husband's ambition. It did not get smaller with setbacks. It got directed. The 1968 campaign was the last one she ran beside him, and he won it, defeating Hubert Humphrey in November. Their daughter Julie married David Eisenhower, the former president's grandson, the following month, in December 1968. 3 years later, in June 1971, Tricia married Edward Cox in a ceremony in the White House Rose Garden. For a brief window, things were full and good. First Lady. On January 20th, 1969, Pat Nixon walked into the White House as First Lady of the United States. She was 56 years old. She had spent more than 20 years in public life, had campaigned in dozens of states, had traveled more miles as Second Lady than any of her predecessors, and had arrived in the position that those years had been building toward. She brought her full attention to it. She worked with White House curator Clement Conger to acquire more than 600 pieces of art and antiques for the White House collection, and renovated most of the rooms on the ground and state floors. She created the spring and fall garden tours that opened the White House grounds to the public. She installed ramps for visitors in wheelchairs, added sign language and audio interpretation for hearing and visually impaired guests, and produced multilingual tour booklets. She started the tradition of illuminating the White House exterior at night. These were not symbolic gestures. They were specific, practical changes to a building she had decided to treat as a genuine public trust. Her signature initiative was volunteerism. She called it the spirit of people helping people, and she meant it personally rather than rhetorically. She toured communities, she met volunteers, she went to places where people were doing unglamorous work and treated them as if their work mattered, because she thought it did. She had been a volunteer of necessity her entire life, doing what needed to be done because no one else was going to do it. In 1969, she flew into South Vietnam and visited a field hospital, becoming the first First Lady to enter an active combat zone. In 1970, she traveled to Peru after a devastating earthquake to deliver humanitarian aid personally. In 1972, she became the first First Lady to travel to Africa, visiting Liberia, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast. That same year, she accompanied the president to China and the Soviet Union, the diplomatic opening that would define his presidency at its best, and was recognized by the Chinese government in a way that went beyond protocol. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai was so charmed by her that he offered two giant pandas as a gift from China to the United States. They went to the Smithsonian's National Zoo. Their names were Xing Xing and Ling Ling, and they became beloved public figures, and the credit for their existence in America belongs entirely to Pat. She was, at the height of her tenure, the most traveled First Lady in American history. She had honorary degrees. She was called Madame Ambassador by the countries she had visited as the president's official representative. She was popular with the press in a way that surprised people who had expected her to be a political wife in the traditional mold. Dutiful, decorative, forgettable. She was none of those things. She was sharp and responsive, and genuinely interested in the people she met. And then, quietly at first, the thing that would take all of it began. The thing she didn't know. In June 1972, 5 men were arrested for breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington. The story was reported, and at first it seemed to most people, including Pat, like a low-level political embarrassment that would pass. She told journalists she knew only what she read in the newspapers, and that was genuinely true. The operation had been planned and run by people inside her husband's campaign committee and within his administration, and she had never been part of either of those worlds. She had been the face of the Nixon political operation for 25 years without ever sitting in the rooms where the decisions were made. That separation, which she had probably accepted as simply the way things were, turned out to matter enormously. What she did not know, and what would become the most legally and personally devastating element of the entire scandal, was that her husband had been secretly recording conversations in the Oval Office since 1971. When the existence of those recordings became known through congressional testimony and the legal battle to obtain them began, Pat's reaction is reported to have been one of quiet fury. She had not known. She had not been told. Julie Nixon Eisenhower later wrote that had Pat known about the tapes, she would have ordered them destroyed the moment she found out. When Pat did learn about them, she described them in terms that said everything about how she experienced her own marriage. They were like private letters, she said, things that belonged to one person alone, things that had no business becoming evidence in a public proceeding. She wished they had never been made. She stood behind her husband publicly through everything that followed. She deflected press questions with short, firm answers. She was not evasive in the way of someone who knows more than they're saying. She was contained in the way of someone who has decided that the only available form of loyalty is to hold the line while everything else gives way. She believed, or forced herself to believe, that the whole thing was being driven by political enemies, that if Richard stayed strong, he could outlast it. Julie later wrote about watching her mother during those months and seeing a kind of strength she had never seen in her before and never would again. The people close to the family watched Pat absorb each new blow, each revelation, each hearing, each resigned official, each front page, and keep standing. And they understood that they were watching someone carry something that had no bottom. She was the last person in the family to accept that resignation was coming. Even as it became clear that the tape recordings contained evidence that went well beyond what could be explained or defended, Pat reportedly urged her husband not to step down. She thought that resigning would be treated as an admission of guilt that would define them permanently. She argued for endurance, for fighting it out in the Senate if it came to impeachment. She lost the argument. The men around Richard, his lawyers, his advisers, the Republican senators who came to the White House to tell him the votes for conviction were there, convinced him before she did. On the night of August 8th, 1974, he told the country he was resigning. Pat was in the family residence. She had not been the one to make that decision, and everyone knew it. The last morning. On the evening of August 8th, 1974, Richard Nixon told the country he was resigning. Pat watched from the family residence. She had not spoken publicly about Watergate in any meaningful way for months. There was nothing left to say. The following morning, August 9th, the family gathered in the East Room for a farewell to the White House staff. Nixon gave a speech that went on for 20 minutes, rambling, at moments raw, in which he read from Theodore Roosevelt's biography and talked about his parents. The cameras rolled the entire time, and they found Pat repeatedly, her face showing the effort it was taking to hold herself together. She had told people later that the cameras were what got to her most, not the leaving itself, but the fact that her anguish was being recorded. The leaving would have been hard in private. In front of the world, it was something else. They walked out onto the South Lawn together, the Nixons and the incoming President Gerald Ford and his wife Betty. As they walked toward the helicopter, Pat turned to Betty Ford and said something that has stayed in the historical record, that Betty would see many red carpets and that she would eventually come to hate them. Then the helicopter rose and the White House got smaller, and they were gone. They flew to California, to their home at La Casa Pacifica in San Clemente, and the door closed behind them. Pat Nixon later told Julie that Watergate was the only crisis that had ever gotten her down. She also said she knew she would never live to see the vindication. Both statements turned out to be true. What came after? The years at La Casa Pacifica were not gentle. Richard Nixon faced the possibility of criminal prosecution until Gerald Ford issued a full pardon in September 1974, 1 month after the resignation. The pardon was deeply controversial. Ford's approval ratings dropped sharply in its aftermath, and there were people who believed it was part of a prior arrangement, though nothing was ever proven. Pat had no public comment on the pardon. She had no public comment on most things anymore. The woman who had been one of the most visible public figures in American life for 2 decades essentially withdrew from it entirely. She gardened. She spent time with Tricia and Julie and their families. She walked on the beach at San Clemente. She did not give interviews, did not attend political events, did not lend her name to causes or write her memoirs, or accept the speaking fees that former First Ladies could reasonably command. She had spent 30 years saying things in public that were useful to other people's purposes, and she was done with that. The silence was not bitterness, as far as anyone could tell. It was more like a person who has been running for decades finally stopping, and finding that the stopping is not a punishment, but a rest. In 1976, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the 2 Washington Post reporters whose coverage had helped bring down the Nixon presidency, published a book called The Final Days, which offered a detailed and unflattering account of Nixon's last months in office, drawn from interviews with hundreds of sources inside the administration. It was the kind of book that reads like an autopsy of a living body. Pat read it. 3 days after she finished, she suffered a stroke. It left her entire left side paralyzed. She was 64 years old. Richard Nixon later told reporters that he believed reading the book had contributed to the stroke. He said, without qualification, that it sure hadn't helped. Pat did not weigh in on that connection publicly. She said only that her recovery from the paralysis was the hardest physical thing she had ever done, which, from someone who had worked a farm without electricity as a child and put herself through college on nothing, is a statement that meant something. Physical therapy eventually restored her movement. It took months of daily, exhausting work, the kind of work she had always known how to do. She regained function. She did not regain her public life. She never returned to active social or political visibility. She appeared in public only on a handful of occasions in the years that followed, carefully, briefly, and always close to family. She and Richard moved to New York City in 1979, to a townhouse on East 65th Street in Manhattan. They lived there briefly before moving in 1981 to a larger house in Saddle River, New Jersey, which gave them space and put them within reach of their children and grandchildren. The grandchildren were, by the accounts of everyone who saw her in those years, the most uncomplicated source of happiness in her life. She was present with them in a way that was different from the composed, managed presence she had maintained in public for decades. She was simply there, and glad to be. In 1983, she had a second stroke, described by her doctors as milder than the first. In 1987, surgeons removed a small cancerous tumor from her mouth. She developed emphysema. She had been a private smoker for years, something almost no one knew at the time because she had never done it in public. And lung infections brought her to the hospital repeatedly through the late 1980s and early 1990s. In July 1990, she appeared publicly for the opening of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Birthplace in Yorba Linda, California. People who saw her that day described her as frail and somewhat bent, but present, still herself, still capable of the particular kind of focused attention she had always given to the person directly in front of her. The portrait painter Henriette Wyeth, who had painted her at San Clemente years earlier, had written about her eyes in terms that stayed in the historical record. They were, Wyeth wrote, the eyes of a 16-year-old girl, an expression of great sweetness. She still believed, despite injustices. In 1992, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. Pat Nixon died at home in Park Ridge, New Jersey, on June 22, 1993. It was the day after her 53rd wedding anniversary. She was 81 years old. Richard, Tricia, and Julie were with her when she died at 5:45 in the morning. Richard Nixon sobbed at her funeral in a way that people who had known him for decades said they had never witnessed in him before. He was gaunt and visibly devastated. He was furious, in a separate grief of his own, that President Clinton and the First Lady did not attend, a grievance he nursed through the last months of his own life. He died 10 months after Pat, on April 22, 1994, of a stroke. They are buried side by side in the gardens of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. What she left. The things Pat Nixon actually did, as opposed to the things that happened to her, are not difficult to find. They have always been in the historical record. They have just tended to get overshadowed by the things that happened to her husband. She acquired more than 600 objects for the White House collection, working methodically with curator Clement Conger to build a permanent collection worthy of the building's history. The renovations she oversaw on the ground and state floors were done with an attention to historical accuracy that professional curators respected. Subsequent administrations benefited from what she had started without necessarily knowing it, which is the particular fate of work done by people who don't need credit to keep going. She made the White House physically accessible to people with disabilities at a time when that was not a standard consideration anywhere in American public life, let alone in government buildings. She added wheelchair ramps, sign language interpretation, audio tours, and multilingual materials for international visitors. These were not gestures, they were infrastructural changes, and they opened the building to people who had never been able to move through it before. She travelled to more countries in her capacity as First Lady than any of her predecessors, a record that stood for 25 years. She went to South Vietnam in 1969, to a field hospital in an active war zone, and sat with wounded American soldiers because she thought they deserved a visit from someone who represented what they had been sent to fight for. She was the first First Lady to enter a combat zone. In 1970, when an earthquake devastated Peru and killed tens of thousands of people, she flew there personally to deliver humanitarian aid, not as a symbolic visit, but as a working trip. She went to Liberia, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast in 1972, becoming the first First Lady to travel to Africa in an official capacity. She supported the Equal Rights Amendment publicly, at a time when that was in tension with significant portions of her husband's political base. She was the first sitting First Lady to publicly support the right to abortion, a position even further outside the expected boundaries of where a Republican president's wife was supposed to stand. She held those positions without making them campaigns, without using them for publicity, apparently just because she thought they were right. She ran every political campaign from 1946 onward without a title, a salary, or official recognition of any kind. She was her husband's most effective public representative for 30 years, and the acknowledgement she received for that was, in practice, the cloth coat speech, a moment in which her modest wardrobe was used as evidence of his integrity on national television, while she sat quietly to the side. She raised 2 daughters who described her not with the obligatory warmth of family obligation, but with the specific, detail-filled love of people who had actually been paying attention to someone for decades. Julie Nixon Eisenhower spent years researching and writing a full biography of her mother, Pat Nixon, The Untold Story, published in 1986. And what comes through it is not the performance of filial devotion, but the genuine effort of a daughter who wanted the world to understand that her mother was a more interesting, more complicated, and more admirable person than history had made room for. The cloth coat, the paralyzed left side, the stroke that came 3 days after finishing a book about the worst period of her life, the garden at San Clemente, the grandchildren whose presence made her come alive in ways her public life hadn't in years, the eyes that a portrait painter said still looked like they belonged to a girl who believed, despite everything. She was born in a miner's shack in Nevada, orphaned before she turned 20, and built a life on nothing but her own capability and her own refusal to give up. She walked into rooms on 5 continents and left people feeling that someone important had actually noticed them. She stood in the East Room of the White House on the worst morning of her life and held herself together for the cameras one more time, because she had been doing that her whole life and she did not know how to stop. She said she would never live to see the vindication. She was right, but the record is there, and it says what she actually did and what she actually was, and none of it required a presidency to be real. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.